Welcome dear students. In this video, let us learn about the final part in the physiology of hearing. We have already learnt about the conductive apparatus, that is how sound is conducted from the external environment to the inner ear, and then about the transduction of mechanical energy into electrical impulses by the sensory organ, that is cochlea. And finally, now let us learn about how these electrical impulses are transmitted to the brain, that is via the auditory pathway. Let us learn about auditory pathway. Now, the auditory pathway is learnt by a very famous mnemonic called as E. coli ma. Okay, before we learn about E. coli ma, tell me, from where does the auditory pathway begin? It begins from the organ of corti in the basilar membrane, which is in the cochlea. So, from the organ of corti, nerve fibers begin, and these nerve fibers form a spiral ganglion, and from there comes the eighth nerve, that is the vestibulocochlear nerve. The cochlear nerve exits the inner ear via the internal acoustic meatus and enters the brainstem. So let us learn about this pathway. First in this pathway is the eighth nerve, E for eighth nerve, that is the auditory nerve or the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is arising from the spiral ganglion, from the hair cells, from the organ of corti. This vestibulocochlear nerve exits the internal acoustic meatus and enters the brainstem. At the pontomedullary junction, there is a nucleus called as cochlear nucleus. Cochlear nerve, cochlear nucleus. From the cochlear nucleus, the nerve fibers cross to the opposite side and synapse in superior olivary nucleus. Superior olivary nucleus. After crossing, we call it lemniscus. Before crossing, it is called tract. So now they have crossed, and from the superior olivary nucleus, it is the lateral lemniscus. These nerve fibers travel via the lateral lemniscus. From the lateral lemniscus, they go into the inferior colliculus. Inferior colliculus of the midbrain. And from there, they go to the medial geniculate body that is present in the thalamus. Medial geniculate body. The center for vision is present in the lateral geniculate body, whereas the center for hearing is present in the medial geniculate body. And then from the medial geniculate body, there are auditory radiations, the thalamic radiations, that go and finally end in the auditory cortex of the brain. Auditory cortex. And this auditory cortex is present in the temporal lobe. It is also known as area number 41 and 42, Brodmann area 41 and 42, also known as Hessel's cortex. Also known as Hessel's cortex. So this is the pathway, this is the auditory pathway. It begins with the eighth nerve. From there they go to the nerve fibers go to the cochlear nucleus. There are two cochlear nuclei, dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. and then they cross to the opposite side and go and synapse in the superior olivary nucleus. And the next order neurons form the lateral lemniscus, which then go to the inferior colliculus and finally to the medial geniculate body, and then via the thalamic radiations they go into the auditory cortex, which is the final destination. And in the auditory cortex, the sound information is interpreted by the brain. So this is the auditory cortex. This auditory cortex is important from both anatomy and physiological point of view, and also an ENT point of view, because while performing certain diagnostic tests, it is essential that we understand the auditory pathway. And also this auditory pathway is important to understand the stapedial reflex. The stapedial reflex itself has multiple functions. Before we understand all that, let us look into a picture for better understanding of auditory pathway. As you can see here, this is the organ of Corti. From here, via the spiral ganglion is coming the 8th nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And these two are the ventral and dorsal cochlear nuclei. Then, this in the pons is the superior olivary nucleus, and this is the inferior colliculus in the midbrain, and this is the thalamus. Here we have the medial geniculate body, and somewhere here is the auditory cortex, area number 41 and 42. Let us see how this pathway looks. So from the organ of Corti is coming the 8th cranial nerve, which goes into the same side and opposite side superior olivary nucleus, and from there the next order neurons go to the inferior olivary nucleus, and from there they go to the medial geniculate body, and from there are radiations into the auditory cortex. This is about the auditory pathway. E. coli ma is a standard mnemonic to remember the same. 8th nerve, cochlear nucleus, superior olivary nucleus. O for olivary nucleus. It is actually the superior olivary nucleus. Then lateral lemniscus, I for inferior colliculus, M for medial geniculate body in the thalamus, and A for auditory cortex. This is the lateral lemniscus. This is our 8th nerve. So we have 8th nerve, so we have the 8th nerve, then cochlear nucleus, superior olivary nucleus, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, medial geniculate body, and finally auditory cortex, E-C-O-L-I-M-A, E. coli ma. This is the auditory pathway. Let us briefly look into the stapedial reflex. So the stapedial reflex is a protective reflex. We have learnt about the stapedius muscle. When there is excessive noise, loud sound, the stapedius muscle contracts and it pulls the stapes posteriorly, and that protects the inner ear from damage. It reduces the force of vibrations. So how is the stapedial reflex formed? Every reflex pathway has an afferent limb, a center, and an efferent limb. Let us see all these in the case of stapedial reflex. So excess sound is perceived by the 8th cranial nerve, and that 8th cranial nerve goes to the superior olivary nucleus, and superior olivary nucleus is the center for stapedial reflex. Now the superior olivary nucleus gives this information to both the facial nerves of both sides, and facial nerve innervates the stapedius muscle and causes it to contract. So the afferent of stapedial reflex is via the 8th nerve. The center is present in the superior olivary nucleus and the efferent is via the 7th nerve. So this stapedial reflex at a time tests the integrity of the 7th nerve, 8th nerve as well as the brainstem. And the stapedial reflex is used as a tool in the assessment of hearing in infants and children, and it can also detect malingerers. So this is about the stapedial reflex. Let us see it in this picture. The 8th nerve carries the sound impulse, and in the superior olivary nucleus there is connection between both the superior olivary nuclei. It transmits the impulse to the 7th nerve, which innervates the stapedius muscle and causes the stapedius muscle to contract. So the auditory pathway helps us in understanding the stapedial reflex, and it is also important in a diagnostic investigation known as BERA. While learning about assessment of hearing, you would understand there is a test known as BERA, and in that the various waves are produced, and it's essential to understand the auditory pathway for a better understanding of that test. So with this we also complete the physiology of hearing, quite a long topic and a conceptual topic as I have told before, with 3 steps. The first step was conductance of sound, the second was transduction of sound into electrical impulses, and this is the final step where those electrical impulses from the organ of Corti are transmitted via the vestibulocochlear nerve into the auditory cortex of the brain. So this is about the mechanism of hearing. I hope you all had a clear understanding about the physiology of hearing. With this understanding, let us move into the next topics further. Thank you very much.